Today's episode is brought to you by Baird Holm. Baird Holm LLP's integrated team of 97 attorneys licensed in 22 states is committed to connecting each of its valued clients to the positive outcomes they seek. With extensive and diverse expertise, we leverage each other's skills to respond efficiently to our clients' local, regional, national, and international legal needs. We are proud to represent public and private companies, individuals, private funds, and other investors, financial institutions, governmental entities, and nonprofit organizations. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Melissa Dergengler, president of Historic Resources Group, Inc. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Our guests today are Eileen and Norman Tyler, authors of Historic Preservation, an introduction to its history, principles, and practice. They're experts in the field of historic preservation, Norman having served as director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Eastern Michigan University from 1990 to 2009, and Eileen as the director of preservation in the Ann Arbor office of Quinn Evans Architects from 1986 to 2014. Norman is a registered architect and a certified planner, and in 2012 was selected as a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and Eileen has been recognized as a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects and the Association of Preservation Technology International. So you've published 3 editions of this book on historic preservation. Can you start off by giving us some background on the inspiration for writing the first book and what your process was for writing this kind of book and the intended audience?
It's an interesting question because we both graduated the same year from the University of Michigan Architecture School, and we went off to Pennsylvania to live off the land for a while. And we were both trained basically in a modernist architecture tradition. We didn't really have much in the way of preservation, or none in preservation, and hardly anything in history at the U of M. But when we were in Pennsylvania, we decided to go to this conference in Harrisburg, which was called a Historic Preservation Conference. And that was new to us. We didn't know what that meant. And so we went there, and all of a sudden we realized this is the kind of architecture we wanted to do. And so we became, basically overnight, we became preservation architects. And that led me then back to the U of M to get an advanced degree in preservation. And that led me to Eastern Michigan University as a faculty member to teach an intro to preservation course, which was one of the most exciting courses I'd taught. And I was able to put into practice all those things that I'd been just learning about. And so the book came about as a result of a course pack. We went to an architecture conference, and we met one of the representatives from Norton Publishing. And I said, I've got this book that I use as a self-published book for my classes. Is Norton interested at all? And she said, yes, we don't have any book like that. Give it to me. And so Norton started publishing their first edition. And it was so successful that they decided to come back and do a second edition. And finally, every 7 or 8 years, we do a new edition. We're up to the 3rd edition now, and it has done very well. So the book, I think, has been so popular because it covers the whole range of preservation topics. Most books on preservation talk about one thing. They talk about the economics, they talk about the history, they talk about the policies. Our book basically covers all of preservation. That's why it's been so useful as an introductory textbook.
What year was the first edition?
I'm going to jump in because that sort of evolved into what we were thinking we talk about next. And as Norm said, he was at EMU, and EMU, he was producing this course pack, and every year you have to produce another course pack. And he realized before too long, the course pack was broken into these chapters that would be very applicable to teaching. So he assembled those course pack lectures and work items into the book and could self-publish it through Graydon Press. And that was in 1994. We even used a colleague and good friend to help us edit, but it was all self-published. And that's when, it was 5 years later that we were at the AIE conference in 1999, that just going through the conference, and the line was too long for the food. So we started talking to vendors, and we were very curious about this book vendor from Norton because she had a great selection of books, but none on preservation. And we thought, why not? So we filled that need, and they picked it up. And because it was already a manuscript with no obligations to any other publisher, she was able to turn it into a book by the next year. And that was the first edition, which I think I have them all here. So that was the first edition. And that was all Norm, and it was largely a transference of the course pack, a book that she had self-published. So after 9 or 10 years, Norton says, hey, this one's selling pretty good. We need a new edition. So that was in 2009. And at that point, we added the colleague from EMU, Ted Ligabell, to help us with some of the understanding of cultural heritage and tourism, which were lacking in the first edition. So we added him as a co-author. And Ted was teaching, he was the director of the program at EMU. Well, that was fine. But then another 8 to 10 years, and Norton started bugging us again. This is a book, it's a successful book. We want to publish it, but we need a new edition. But Norm said, I'm not doing it again. This is the second edition. And we get to design the covers. That was kind of fun. The third edition, it would take an entirely new approach, a lot of new research, and expand a lot of the definitions and the inclusiveness of preservation on many levels. And as it happened, we had two things in line for producing the third edition. And one was that we invited a young preservationist, Sarah Marsom, to participate with us. She was a graduate of EMU, and she was starting to do a lot of consulting all across the country. And she could add the perspective of the young preservationist, an emerging whole career in preservation that was not really covered in our earlier course pack and publications. And she was invaluable in seeing through all that text and saying, but why don't you mention this community? Why don't you mention some of the more difficult issues of cultural heritage? And she was very helpful throughout the book, but particularly in those areas. And one other footnote to this process is that I retired from Quinn Evans Architects in 2014, which was just at this time that Norton was pushing for the new edition. So Norm really didn't want to have to start over, but for me, it was very fresh. So I was then the lead author and contact for Norton, and then I would really corral all of the editing process that Sarah contributed and that Norm continued to contribute, and Ted Ligabell. So it changed the whole relationship with Norton at that point. And then we had our big book release in 2018. We pushed them to have it done in time for the APT conference in Buffalo, and did a book signing and book release there to really jumpstart it with what we felt was a really great audience for the book.
Building on that, so Norm, would you describe the process of pulling together that first edition? And do you think it was driven by the course, or did you feel like in organizing the course, there were gaps in information that you needed to pull those case studies together for? And then how does that differ from the third edition, which is sort of what we were just pulling into?
The first edition is very dear to my heart because it just spilled out of me. I felt I had so many things I wanted to say, and I was able to say to students that it took almost no time to put it into a book form. I've written maybe 6 or 7 books. No book was easier to write than that first edition of our book. It just was what I wanted to say about preservation. I was wondering, why don't other people have said this? Why don't they talk about this at conferences? It was really intended to be a book, not only for students, but for people who are going on to a historic district commission, who maybe get appointed to something that they're not real familiar with, or city officials who have to deal with preservation but don't understand the issue. It's really meant to be a primer for all of those kinds of people. And so to say it's a textbook, I think sort of it underestimates its value. And I think that I talked to the head of the National Trust because I asked her to do an intro to the third edition. And I asked her, are you familiar with the book? She says, Norm, all the people here have that book on our shelves. It made me feel good. She says, I'd love to write an introduction for your book. And so I think that, it was a very personal experience. The second and third editions, when Eileen and Ted came on, it became a more serious book. We filled in some of the gaps, and I understood why that was. And it became a little bit more work to put those editions together because we wanted to make it, we realized that there were things that were gaps in the first edition. But I always loved the first edition for that reason.
So moving on from that, will you describe how the third edition, which has just recently been published, as Eileen said, 2018, how does it differ from that first edition? And why did you think this was a good time to update the book?
Norton really told us in no uncertain terms, if we didn't do it, somebody else would. They wanted to continue this title. They had the right to do that. And they didn't really evaluate what might be missing or what wasn't well said in terms of the audience of the book. It really fell to us to look at what was missing. And I'm looking at the table of contents here, and the whole issue of sustainability and importance of pride of place was really not very much part of the first edition. I mean, it might have been subtly mentioned as these places were designated for such and such a reason, the economic value, but we really didn't take a whole chapter and focus on cultural heritage and whose cultural heritage it really was. So in the third edition, especially, we really had the interpretation of our heritage. We toned back on some of the economics because that didn't seem to connect directly with what our audience was saying about the book. And we focused more on reinterpretation of heritage and the sustainability. We really wanted to end with sustainability, which we didn't do in the second edition, because ending on it, it's like saying, if we don't address this problem of climate change, global warming, and our fragile planet, we are not going to have anything to preserve. So we really wanted to end with that. We wanted to lead into it by saying all these other people are part of this story of cultural heritage, but the sustainability, the embodied energy of existing buildings, we didn't feel we were doing it justice if we didn't really emphasize that right at the end.
Let me add a little bit to that if I can, because the first and second edition were basically, Eileen and I are architects. And so we dealt with the physical side of preservation. We're talking about buildings, and we're talking about how to preserve buildings, which is how most people come into historic preservation. But by the third edition, we started to deal with the fact that preservation is more than just saving buildings. And one of the examples I use in the book is I call nouns and verbs. And if you look at a sentence structure, nouns are about the thing in a sentence. Verbs are about what happens to that thing. And what we needed to start to cover more in the book were the verbs, what preservation was doing and how it was doing it. And so we started to get into topics that were much more difficult because they were softer topics. We can talk very easily about how to preserve a building. It's very difficult to talk about how to preserve a culture. And so especially when we get into something called thanatourism. And thanatourism is the tourism of places that are sad, the places like the Japanese internment camps or the slavery plantations. And that's very much part of the history of preservation too, because I was talking to an African American one time and I was talking about saving the theater. And they said, that theater, all that represents to us is the place where we had to sit in the balcony while everybody else sat on the main floor. And I realized that African Americans have a very different look at preservation than we do with our cultural heritage. And I think that's important to recognize. And that's what we tried to recognize in the third edition.
Especially in the last couple of years, 4 years, maybe, even since the third edition has been published, we've evaluated and many people interpret and are looking at history from a different point of view and a different perspective. So would you share your thoughts on the places from the first era of historic preservation that may not interpret or present history as we would present it today, building much on what you were just talking about, Norm? And in your opinion, do you think there's value in preserving them as an example of that place or that period of time? Or is the view on history and a more inclusive, holistic presentation of the era more valuable?
I don't know if I want to evaluate what's better than the other. They're both important. But I think when we look at the eras of historic preservation, which I think is the crux of your question, we go back to saving Mount Vernon, which was basically done at a private sector by a bunch of women. Pamela Cunningham was well known for that. And basically, she went to the government and said, here's the president's house. Shouldn't we save it? And the government said, no, we don't do that. And so it was a real lesson because if we were going to do preservation, it had to be in the private sector. The government finally stepped in and said, okay, we're going to do some preservation, but it's going to be of parks. It won't be of buildings. The government doesn't preserve buildings. That's up to the private sector. But we'll preserve parks because that's part of our heritage. And so they established the National Park Service in 1916. And Yellowstone was the first park. So the government had stepped in, but it's still up to the private sector. And the first regulated historic district was Charleston in 1931. And finally, a city said, all right, we're going to have some regulations to preserve buildings because things are happening that we don't like, and we're going to have to establish some laws. And so it became a private sector enterprise then, and only with the National Trust being established in 1949 did the government say, well, maybe the government should have a role in dealing with buildings. And so they started dealing with buildings with the National Trust, although it's not an official government agency. It was supported by Congress with funding, but it was a kind of a quasi-public-private effort based on the British example, and they basically were established to preserve certain landmark historic structures. They had a small number of very important buildings that they preserved. And so all of this came together to end this wonderful story of how preservation has come about. In 1966, the government said, okay, we're going to establish the rules for doing preservation. And the rules are that the federal government's not going to do anything. We're going to leave it up to the states. And every state should have their own preservation office. And they should then empower local governments to do preservation. And so what happened with the 1966 Act is it empowered local governments to save buildings. The National Register, which was part of the 1966 Act, doesn't save any buildings. That's one thing that most people don't realize. If you're on the National Register, there's no protection in being on the National Register. It's only honorific. If you want to preserve buildings, it has to be at the local level. So it's been interesting to see that shift from Anne Pamela Cunningham working at the local level to save Mount Vernon to the 1966 Act, which is saying to the local governments, it's up to you to save buildings. So there's kind of a nice history there through the different eras of preservation.
And I'm thinking about and maybe this is a little off track, but the movement where many are removing statues that are offensive to others and that sort of thing. And is there value in preserving those as a reflection of that era, or is our more inclusive interpretation important? But that leads directly into the next question, which is your thoughts on making preservation more accessible. As you had mentioned, Norm, it has a reputation as the pursuit of the gentry, and through history has often been led by women's groups like Anne Pamela Cunningham's efforts to save Mount Vernon, or even a little later, the Daughters of the American Revolution to save many of the Civil War battlefield sites. And in making it more accessible, how do you see technology contributing to this? And how is preservation elevated from heritage tourism to really a critical planning element that can define the character and identity of places?
Well, Eileen's been involved for many years in the Association for Preservation Technology. So she has been very tuned into this international organization that deals with technology. So Eileen, why don't you talk a little bit about how this has changed?
I guess what's interesting is when you're no longer involved in academics, or as a student particularly, I was teaching for many years at EMU as well. It's like, what continues to happen? What opportunities to continue to come to you that open your eyes to new ways of looking at what we do? And for me, APT has done that. Going to events, lectures, or visiting in different places in your own neighborhood or around the world, you may have your eyes opened about how differently people will see their heritage sites and how they're threatened and what we can do to save them. So when we did the third edition, we tried really hard to find examples that went well beyond our usual storehouse of those case studies that we started with, places that everybody knows are important, like Mount Vernon. What places are lesser known, and why are they lesser known? Is it just simply the word hasn't gotten out, or is there a different strategy for protecting them? And one of the examples I've always enjoyed trying to explain, I can't explain it as well in my own words, but I really felt like, this is a light bulb that goes on for me. And almost every year, something like this happens at APT. I just have been very inspired by the organization. It's my continuing education. Our guest lecturer one year, I was asked to escort him around. And so I got to know him a little well. He was from Chile, and he spoke about how communities are threatened from a different perspective. So there's this neighborhood in Santiago that was built in the early 19th century, and it was going to be housing in a neighborhood for wealthier people. Well, over time, it changed, and different people were living there. And then the pressure to change things in there was threatening the current residents and what they had added to the value of this neighborhood. And they were very frustrated that the government wouldn't listen to them. So they ended up being able to protest and organize enough against this encroaching development and the gentrification, and got the support of the local and then the national authorities to give them a status that prevented these tearing down their values and putting other buildings in place of their traditional architecture. And I think it's like giving people the tools, demanding them, and then granting them the tools to define their own culture based on what the current living situation is, not what it was 100 or 200 years before, which people from outside might think is grand and must be protected. They're not living there. And it's trying to listen to the people that are living in these communities and then giving them that voice. Hopefully you get these little bits. We have a whole bunch of examples in the book, and you hopefully can see, oh, that's what happened in that part of the world. That's what happened in another part of the world. Maybe we can apply some of that knowledge and thinking about what we're trying to preserve and how we can go about doing it. It's a different strategy in every location.
Yeah, and the vitality, I mean, in order for preservation to be successful, there has to be a vital element that keeps it, an active living place. And I know I read somewhere or heard somewhere a good definition of historic preservation as just the management of change. And I think as, we progress and we look at all the new technology and all of the issues that you brought up in this recent edition, it's a big consideration for many in the field today.
I'm just in the process of reviewing all the papers for the upcoming APT conference. And every once in a while, I get really excited because I feel like they're not public yet, but I can tell you anyway. Every once in a while, you can see that somebody is really touching on something that is a voice that needs to be heard. And if you know a little bit about it, then for me, I'm so grateful that somebody has taken a risk to present this issue. And the example is the community of Over the Rhine in Cincinnati. It's a really challenged community just outside of downtown, and it's sort of isolated because of the geography. And I'd been there maybe 20, 25 years ago, and it was a struggling kind of urban part of town with a little rumblings of what might be taking place. Well, we went there, right? I guess 2019, it was so scary because it was like people were having their rugs ripped out right up from underneath them. The loss of this community was so apparent to anyone who would be sensitive to preservation. And it seemed like they had no voice. The development pressures were so strong. And that's where you want to have people have the tools and know where to go and be able to make the right kind of protest to preserve their community and in some sense of the integrity of what was there both architecturally and culturally.
No, that's a good kind of representation about what we've been talking about, the evolution of preservation that is also reflected in the different editions of your book. Preservation started as only caring about the building and what the building represented and not the community that's there. And I think that's a big part of what preservation has evolved into is the community and the culture that is contained within those districts and those buildings and preserving that as well.
Let me give you a little example from my own experience that I think relates to that. While I was teaching at Eastern Michigan University for over 20 years, I started developing a simulation which put students into role playing in a little town called Rivertown, a fictional city. And over time, I gradually added more online features to it. But they had to preserve that town of Rivertown. And so we had preservation students and planning students who had to, and I would respond from my experience on if they made a decision, what that decision would mean. And I think the fact that they did role playing and they started to really care by the end of the semester about what happened in Rivertown, that kind of experience, not only of just preserving buildings, but of preserving a community. And I found it interesting because I had two kinds of students. The preservation students would come in, they immediately knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to preserve all the old buildings in the city. The planning students didn't know what to do because saving a community is so much more complex than just saving the old buildings. And so they tried to deal with some of the issues of homeless shelter and financing and downtown development authorities and all of those kinds of things that go with it. And so, preservation seen as preserving old buildings is very limited in scope. It's much more than that, much broader than that. And that was a lesson. And almost every student took the class said it was the best class they had because they had the experience on dealing with the world as it came at. And there are many different ways. I wanted to use one other example too, because when we talk about ways to do preservation, one of my favorite examples is the Issei Shrine in Japan. The Issei Shrine, what they decided was the way they wanted to preserve the building was to completely rebuild this shrine every 20 years. And so what they would do is they would make it the way they did it hundreds of years ago. They would get the same wood, they would put it together in the same way. After 20 years, they would move to a site right next door, completely rebuild this thing from scratch by going out into the woods, getting the same woods and rebuilding it, and then taking down the one that was there. And every 20 years, they would replace the building. That's an interesting approach to preservation, which is completely different than the American experience. And so then I looked at how do they do it in China? And China isn't really interested in preserving buildings. They preserve it through oral histories and through, diagrams and through drawings and things like that. That's their way of doing preservation. So when we only look at the American experience of preservation, I think we're looking at it in too limited a way. And what we tried to do in the book, there's one chapter that looks at different parts of the world and their approaches to preservation. And I think there are some real lessons there on ways that we can expand.
At the back of your new edition of the book, you present issues like sustainability and green building, which are all very popular issues today. But this introduces the concept that preservation is more than just a cultural construct, but an environmental one as well. How can the conflicting paradigm between historic preservation and sustainability or the green building movement be resolved? For example, many of the recognition organizations really don't look at retention of materials as an efficient way to deal with the building, and particularly, when you look at window replacements and things like that, and the conflict between energy efficiency versus filling up the landfill. And so I'd be interested in your perspective on those issues and how you presented them in this third edition.
It evolved from the second edition, where we began with a very popularized quote at the time of the greenest building is the one that's already built. And Carl Elefante is a good friend and colleague, a former colleague, because we're both retired from Quinn Evans. And so we could talk in depth and I could draw on some of what he was saying, the greenest building, but there were no analytics, no diagnostic procedures. And I don't think we had enough I tried to get into it more in the third edition by talking about quantifying the embodied energy of the existing buildings and trying to evaluate it objectively as a quantifiable amount. And there are better tools, even in the 4 years since we wrote the third edition, but it is all about calculating the embodied energy and also taking into account the negative impacts that are air pollution and landfill filling and the energy to fabricate and transport new materials. All those things can be calculated as you consider whether or not demolishing is the appropriate action. So that even if you say, well, your new building is zero net carbon, you're going to take 75 plus or minus years to recover the negative environmental impact of removing it. And I know Norm's involved in a little bit of a community project right now, and it's a 50-year-old building on a site that is at the crux of it. And I'm saying, well, I know that building's not perfect, and I know that people don't like working in it, and I know it's where we want to do something else on that lot, but it is an existing building. It is very substantially built with heavy masonry and steel. And it's very difficult for me from this perspective to say, okay, weigh the pros and cons, because you're going to have a negative effect of embodied energy to this property. And you must be forced to calculate that in the total environmental impact. And not enough communities require that. So raising awareness of embodied energy and making that part of the review process, I think, is essential in looking at the total cost and impact on each community where this happens over and over again.
I think that we all agree that understanding embodied energy and the greenest building is the one that's been built is a very good philosophy to go on. To counter that a little bit, it's like, should we try to preserve every old building that exists? Because in a pure sense, that's what we're saying is every old building ought to be preserved. That, I think, is inappropriate because there are old buildings that deserve to be preserved because of their significance. And we have to understand something that I've tried to do a metric for of what is the level of significance? And the level of significance is how important is it historically, how appropriate is it architecturally, how much integrity does it have? What does it mean to the community? Did George Washington sleep there or not? All of those things go into what I call a significance thermometer that goes up and down based on all of those things. Has it been moved? Is the original site there? Is it in the original context? All of those things have to be factored in. And I won't say it's a formulaic thing, but it's almost a formulaic thing in that some buildings you should say, well, we have a greater community purpose in letting that one go and saving these over here. And we have to be able to have those kinds of levels of discretion in the decisions that we make. So I agree with Eileen 100% that we ought to be very conscious of that and be able to evaluate that. But we have to put it in a larger context of not only what is our past, but what is our future for our communities.
So it's an ongoing discussion, but having the tools to calculate the embodied energy and offset how much that is offset in time against what's proposed is all part of the bigger picture.
I wanted to build on that a little bit with the additional challenge of modern day building codes and trying to get a historic building or an existing building to conform to our requirements of safety and egress and those sorts of issues, which are, of course, highly important in any building. And, managing that sort of conflict that an existing building or certainly one built prior to a certain era or from a certain date will never conform to a contemporary application of building code.
There was a little book in our office that I don't even know if it's published anymore. It probably is. It was put out, I think, by U.S. Gypsum that was called Prior Proofing of Archaic Building Materials. And it was this wonderful this is a little book, but it was U.S. Gypsum. And so what they did was take ordinary building construction from a long time ago and evaluate the performance in fire separation of those non-traditional materials that you'll find in the older building, but aren't strictly regulated by codes today. And so they're considered non-conforming unless you get someone to recognize those archaic building systems as valid. So for instance, you have clay tile with plaster on either side. That's considered performing like a fire-rated gypsum board on concrete block or even on wood. So you can get these. I'm not going to do a direct comparison because I don't have the book in front of me, but I found it very helpful in looking at egress paths and distance to egress and fire protection systems being required when I was doing work like that. And usually it was accepted. There's a wonderful committee within ABT that researches building codes and tries to encourage changes in building codes. They, again, are usually local and adopted by state, so you do have to often request a variance. I also know that you asked about the simpler parts of a project, and I did have one little example that dealt with windows, because people often feel like, low-hanging fruit, I'm just going to change my windows. So with trepidation, I'll say, did you change your windows yet? And if they say no, well, good, because there are other solutions. It depends on the project. I know of a really great storm window company that is, to my mind, the best out there for protecting historic windows. And when it's appropriate to use a storm window, this is the only way to go. But I had a really wonderful little story. 2013, I did a very short little report for a historic museum that was in an adapted old post office building in Holland, Michigan. And it was very low budget, simple approach. And I gave them all kinds of detail. And I said, well, when you get ready to do this, to address your problems of condensation, it's a museum, a lot of condensation issues. And they had done layers and layers on both sides of every window, but the original windows were still there. And I said, okay, here's your solution. And I looked at what they had done. I looked at the fact that they still had their historic windows. And I said, well, here's what you need to do. Take all that stuff off and put on a good storm window. And here's, I gave them a budget. I gave them the whole thing. And then I had to walk away from it because that's all the report was. Well, then 3 years ago, when our preservation conference was in Holland, I walked over there because I wanted to see how the windows were doing. It had been 4 or 5 years. And I walked in, I said, I want to look at the windows. Whoa, the museum director jumped up and said, is that Eileen Tyler? And I said, oh, we did everything you said in your report and it's worked like a charm. It's great. And it's just like, sometimes you don't know, but if you're passionate about your solution and you're confident in your solution, perhaps you could inspire people to move forward with an incremental step that really does more than just save the windows, save the building. It looked 100% better. And they were really pleased. That was very gratifying for me as a professional.
I think that's great. And at a conference recently, a window company who did storm windows shared that one of the things they wanted to know is, why do people want to replace their windows? And most come to it from the assumption that it's from an efficiency or an energy efficiency point of view. And when they did a survey, they had 5 options. And of course, energy efficiency was one of them. But what they found came back as 2 of the top, higher than energy efficiency. One was keeping up with the Joneses. They wanted their place to look like it's been maintained. But the other was the number 1 was noise. And they found that so interesting because so many are coming at the issue of windows from a certain point of view without necessarily maybe considering the whole environment about why a new window would be needed. And much of that is because, of course, many historic buildings have a different use today than their intended use when they were first built. So you have people living in warehouse districts with heavy traffic, with railroad traffic that were never meant to be residential properties in the first place. And so this company found that one of their biggest demands was for new windows was more noise than it was energy efficiency. So then they developed a storm window that had an acoustical value to address those issues. And so I think too, building on that and what you just said of trying to provide as many options and reasons why is really important, because we're often looking at it from one point of view and somebody thinks they want a new window from an entirely different point of view because they need noise control because they're living in a downtown area in a building that was never meant to be a residential building, perhaps.
But we live in downtown. It's only Ann Arbor, but we live a block from the fire station, the police station, and all these cars and buses that go by, and we don't hear a thing. The glass is sealed in such a way, and the whole frame is so tight-fitting that our windows in the interior, the historic windows, can breathe and move, but the storm window is absolutely quiet. And of course, for a museum, even though it's still a small town, it's pretty busy right where they are. It is a real benefit. And I don't think to mention that first. So I'm glad you said that. But clearly, if it comes down to it in describing the benefit of the storm window decision, better acoustic performance is definitely a part of it.
I know that windows are a huge factor when it comes to preserving old buildings, as is evidenced by what we've just had in this discussion. But I'd like to cite one other example because you talked about building codes. And we live in Ann Arbor, and it has one Frank Lloyd Wright house, the Palmer House, which we stayed in overnight a few weeks ago. And the Palmer House has a few very low steps that go up to the front door. These steps are only about 2 or 3 inches high. And so it's an easy walk up those steps. And the city is insisting on putting a handrail along those steps because that's what the code says. And the owners say that destroys the character of the Frank Lloyd Wright building. What can we do? Can't we argue that it's not necessary, it's not dangerous? And so they called us, and we called the city, and we found out that you're going to have to put a handrail no matter what. And so now we're trying to advocate for the owners because we feel that it really isn't necessary. And so Eileen called the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, where she's on the board, and she asked the same questions. They said, well, this is a very common problem, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation recognizes that there's nothing you can do about it. If the code says you have to put on a handrail, you have to put on a handrail whether it's a Frank Lloyd Wright house or not. So sometimes, you get a little frustrated with those codes because they are.
And I told them that if they actually were in a historic district, they might have some recourse through the historic district, but they're not. So it's only the regular building inspectors who are being persnickety about the code, and they're afraid to be exposed to any liability for the city by not requiring them to meet code. We added a handrail to our front steps, which is a Greek revival. And I showed them how we did it. And there's a local metal fabricator who can assemble a handrail that doesn't attach to the walls. It attaches to the steps themselves. It's a reversible treatment. So you look at the Secretary of the Interior standards, reversibility, and what, generally, what is the impact? And they actually like if they're going to be forced to do it, they like that solution. And they've already talked to that fabricator about producing it for them. So they may feel like, okay, we're on the right path. If the city will give them an extension on this enforcement, they proceed with this handrail. And the Wright Conservancy had no problem with that kind of attachment, because as long as you could avoid putting it on the brick, which is they hadn't thought of. They thought they had to attach this to the brick. I said, no, you don't want to do that.
You both mentioned that you're retired and you had exciting and interesting careers and are still very active in preservation. And would you tell us about some of the more exciting or memorable experiences you've had in the field?
I'm not sure which one I want to say, because I get excited about my work. I love my work. I often refer to our very first so-called job when we graduated from college as Vista volunteers and assigned to a design center back in the 70s. That was the thing. And I think that it was in that experience, it's so memorable, that I began to understand the role of advocacy in preserving the underserved and isolated communities and appreciating a less iconic preservation of places that mattered to the people who lived there. That had lasted me. Again, we didn't go to that preservation conference in Pennsylvania until 5 or 6 years later. And then I've certainly worked on many iconic and monumental buildings in my career, but I never forgot that there are people that need to have their voice heard in what they're preserving. And I think that was a very lasting memory that I never got in school, but happened, in a very impressionable time right after school. And I highly recommend that kind of an experience to expose you, any kind of a workshop type of experience to expose people early on about the role of advocacy for the community. Go ahead, Norm.
One of my most memorable experiences I've had in my career relates to a different book that we wrote called Greek Revival in America. And we live in a Greek Revival house, and it has 4 columns. It's considered to be one of the best Greek revivals in Michigan. It's a beautiful house. And one day Eileen was coming home from work, and one of the columns had fallen to the sidewalk. And so we realized, whoops, this house needs some maintenance. We just bought the house, and we realized that the former owners had owned it for 110 years, and they had left some maintenance requirements. And so we had to put this column back together, and we started to look at the details of how this 22-foot high column made out of white pine, small boards, which tapered toward the top, how that ever got built in the 1841 was a real question for us. So we started to do some research on our house. And we found out that because of its significance as a Greek Revival house, we wanted to know where this idea came from. It's one of the best Greek revivals and one of the first houses in Ann Arbor. How did this happen? So I traced it back to New York State, where the owner of the house came from, and I found one Greek Revival house in every town that was owned by the mayor or the bank president. And so I realized that was a style that was part of New York's heritage, and it was all based on what they call pattern books, or books that had drawings of Greek Revival houses that came out of England. So Eileen and I decided to make a trip to Europe to look for the first Greek Revival building in the world, and we did find it. And it was based on a book that came out of Greece by a couple people, Stuart and Rivette, who did drawings in Athens when the Turks were still there, and their lives were in danger, but they were on the Acropolis doing drawings of these buildings. And we said, well, we traced it all back through these pattern books, that our house must have come from that pattern book, which was based on the Acropolis. So we assumed it was from the Temple of Athena Nike on the top of the Acropolis. Well, at that time, the temple didn't exist, but there was another temple in a different part of town that turns out to be the temple that our house is based on. So we had a direct connection from 2,500 years before to our house. We could trace it from that temple to England, to New York, to our house. And it's a marvelous Odyssey book. And while we were in Greece then, we met a Greek architect over there, and he had a house in Mykonos, so we started doing the islands. And he said, you got to go to an island called Delos, because Delos is an island that's filled with Greek ruins, but nobody lives there anymore because it's considered to be a spiritual place that's left to the Greek gods. And so we went there and we saw all these remnants of temples, and there was one of the temples that was from the site where our house design came from. And so all of a sudden on Delos, we felt that we had the spirit of Artemis Agraterra, who was the sister of Apollo that was basically the progenitor of our house. So now we know that Artemis Agartera is the goddess that represents our house. And all of a sudden, all this started to come into my mind. And Lazarus, the Greek architect, said, Norm, what you are experiencing is something, there's a Greek word for it called temenos. And I said, what's temenos? He says, that's a word that's very important for you to understand because it means you understand the spirit of the place. You now understand more than just the physical building. You now understand the spirit of your house. And so when I came back home, we added that as the last section from our book. We explained our Odyssey and also how important temenos was to us. And as I laid in bed going to sleep, and I still do every night, I look at the top of the column where you have the scroll work, and I fall asleep by looking at the scroll work, thinking about the spirit of my house. And it's a wonderful way to sort of carry with me for many years the sense of spirit or temenos. And so that to me was a magical kind of experience that it's hard to describe to anybody else. I hope I've done a little bit of a job of it, but it was very meaningful to me.
That's one of the best preservation stories I think I've heard, and both excellent examples of just those influences in your career and your lives. That's a great story. And some of that is described, I believe, on your website as I was looking through, and we'll share the website at the very end. But the final question or thought I wanted to leave with is, what are the key elements of preservation that you would like the general public to understand or appreciate, or better yet, even just accept as a part of planning and their environment?
One way I have tried to absorb my learning from all these different experiences so that what I do when I go to a new site, I have to observe. You have to learn how to see things, and you have to give yourself time to see them, and not through the lens of a camera or your phone. You have to see them first, photograph them at the end, and absorb that information, like the temenos, I guess, of each place. So I was teaching for 15 years, basically how to write a historic structure report or conditions assessment, that kind of a documentation effort. And it's sort of leading community revitalization efforts like workshops and charrettes and that sort of thing with people. And one of the things that I have tried to oversimplify, it's in the book too, I try to oversimplify the whole approach is that you look at what you have and what you want and how you get there. It's like if you can just get the feeling of looking at what you have, figuring out separately what you want, then you can probably find a way to bring them together in some meaningful way that gets you to your goal. And it can be in the case of a building analysis or fixing your windows, what you have, what you want, how do we get there? And you can use this as a guide, and I would teach this in how to write a historic structure report. In another category is a very simple approach to problem solving. And if I even go back to architecture school, it's the best learning tool you get from probably any education, but architecture school specifically, we always thought was techniques and tools for problem solving. Now, some of that doesn't sink in until later. And so through the course of my work, and because of teaching, what you have, what you want, and how do you get there?
I guess if I wanted to make a final point, it would be that based on my experience, and I wear three hats. I'm a preservationist. I think you can recognize that. I'm also an architect. I have my license and I practice as an architect. I'm also a certified urban planner. So I feel comfortable going to any of those three conferences, and I'm very comfortable with all three of those topics. And my career has been built around how can you bring those topics together? Because architects should not ignore planning, and neither of them should ignore preservation. And yet what I see is in cities that preservation is separate and apart from comprehensive plans. And so when a city does a comprehensive plan, it very seldom includes a preservation component because the Historic Preservation Commission wants to be separate and apart. And they want to have their own districts and their own control. And that's very frustrating for me. And so a colleague and I, we went around and we surveyed all the state governments in the country to ask, what is your role in, because everybody has an enabling act at the state level for a comprehensive plan. Communities have to do a comprehensive plan. And does your comprehensive plan say that it should include preservation? And we found that 2 states included preservation as part of their comprehensive plan. And that was a real shock to me. And so we followed up in those 2 states. How's it working? They said, oh, we ignore that. Even when it's part of it, they ignore it. And I think that to me is something that I would like to sort of address in some way. I'm not sure how, because no one else seems particularly interested. The planners aren't interested in incorporating preservation. The preservationists aren't interested in being part of planning. It sounds like you should be, but that's not the way the world works. And so I would love to find a way, and I'm pushing this in Michigan, to have the Enabling Act for Comprehensive Planning include a requirement to include something about historic preservation. So that would be one of the takeaways I would give to this. We have to integrate preservation much more into our overall planning and not have it separate and apart from everything else.
Well, this has been a really lovely conversation. I really appreciate the time and getting to know both of you, reading your book first as a very objective, participant, and then getting to know you both and looking at your website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining, and we'll make sure to link your website and where to get the book in the show notes.